So today in class, you started looking a little bit at Chinese history and how Chinese history fits in with the rest of the world and what was going on in China when other things were going on in other places that we've already studied this year. So ultimately, the goal of this PowerPoint is to give you a little introduction to several philosophies that became important in some of these Chinese dynasties. But in order to talk about the philosophies, we need to talk a little bit about what dynasties are and how they came to power. So first, you see a picture here with a bunch of questions underneath it. So take a couple seconds and look at this picture and figure out, what are you seeing? Who's holding the helmet, or who is the man in the helmet? Who are the people holding the sticks? What are they doing? Why do you think a military leader would order his men to destroy crops? How do you think the peasant to the left feels about what's happening? And then what does this image suggest about life during this time in Chinese history? So we'll talk about this tomorrow in class, but just start thinking about what this might suggest about Chinese history. All right, so in order to understand more about the history of China, you need to understand what dynasties are. So a dynasty is a sequence of rulers that were considered members of the same family. So you can see in this image, the dynastic cycle was when one dynasty, the old dynasty, would be in power. They would eventually lose the mandate of heaven, which is what I'm going to talk about in a couple of slides, and then they would have problems, and then a new dynasty would come to power. But dynasties could last for hundreds and hundreds of years. Essentially, as long as the ruler was part of the same family, then it was part of the same dynasty. So for a 2,000-year period, you could have no more than 5 or 6 dynasties. But dynasties lasted in China from 1500 BCE all the way up until the 1900s. So you're talking about a structure that lasted almost 2,000 years. We're going to look right now not at the first dynasty, but actually at the second dynasty. And that dynasty is called the Zhou dynasty. And the Zhou dynasty started in 1045 BCE. So we're talking about around 3,000 years ago. And they went into central China and they overthrew the Shang dynasty. And the Shang dynasty was the first dynasty in Chinese history. You'll learn a little bit more about them later in the week. But for now, we're just going to look at the Zhou dynasty because that's when some important things happen that affect the rest of China. You can see on the map here that this gray area is the Zhou dynasty. So it looks like it's about a third maybe of modern day China. So modern day China, you all know, has this red border right here, and then those black lines are the part of the Great Wall that the Zhou dynasty built. But the Great Wall that exists today is not the same Great Wall that was built during this period of time. So, introduction to the Zhou dynasty, because all that we're going to talk about next happened during the Zhou dynasty. So, early years of any dynasty, the Zhou dynasty came up with this concept of the mandate of heaven. Basically that if a leader was in power, it was because of the heavens, because of the gods. They said, yes, this is the leader that needs to be in power. So on this wheel, you can see it as a cycle. So a powerful new dynasty receives the mandate of heaven, meaning the gods have selected this leader. As we've talked about in previous regions of the world, the gods played a lot of, the gods had a big role in deciding who the leader was going to be, and this was the case in China as well. So then the new emperor comes, changes the government, restores peace and harmony, and life begins to improve for the people because the government is watching out for the people. I'm just reading straight from this cycle so you can follow along as I'm going. Generations pass, the new dynasty becomes more corrupt, meaning they start to take their own interests and they start to try to make more money for themselves, and they're not really concerned with their people anymore. And over time, they start to lose the mandate of heaven. There are disasters, peasant uprisings, floods, droughts, famine, the people rebel, and eventually the emperor is overthrown. Now, this is just how the Chinese philosophers explained how the new government came to power. So whether you believe that the gods elected the leader or not, it's not up for debate because that's what the Chinese philosophers believed. So, once the dynasty had the mandate of heaven, they were going to be in power. During the Zhou dynasty, they start to come up with a structure called feudalism. Because the Zhou dynasty was so big, the king wasn't able to control all of the land. So what happens is the king breaks the land up into smaller pieces and assigns people that he considers to be loyal to him to basically govern the smaller regions. Clicking over to a map, you can see, if this is the Zhou dynasty right here, these different colored areas would be the feudal land that was divided up between the lords. Each lord would then hire soldiers and get peasants to live on the land. So everybody in the feudal system has a role. The king oversaw all of the territories. The lord governed the one land that he had been given, and in exchange, he had to be extremely loyal to the king. He would collect taxes and pay them to the king, but he got to basically oversee and ensure that the people living on the land were following the laws. The soldiers protected that land from outside invaders, and the peasants farmed on the land. The soldiers and the peasants, in exchange for their service, in exchange for their fighting, were given a place to live without having to pay for it. So you see the Zhou dynasty, and you see the way the land was broken up. This is a really great system. It actually you'll see it in 7th grade history. Europe, during the medieval times, during the Dark Ages, also used feudalism when the king wasn't able to control all of the land himself. The problem was there starts to be some conflict between all of the lords. By the 700s BCE, the lords had started to feel like they had more power than the king. So even though the king was technically the leader of everybody, the lords who had been given this opinion and the ability to have an opinion start to have their opinions, and it leads to a warring states period. And this is an important period of time in Chinese history because all these small states that you had seen in the previous map start to quarrel with each other. And basically they group into 6 or 7 large states, and there are wars, and there's not one central government for this 250-year period. And during this period of time, and this is where we're getting to with this whole introduction, this is when a bunch of different philosophies come about what the best way to govern is. You've probably seen the word Confucianism or heard of Confucius before, but the other ones may be more new to you. But during the Warring States period, the leaders come together and start questioning what's the best way to govern. There has to be one best way. And it leads to this big discussion with all of these philosophers known as the 100 Schools of Thought. And from the 100 Schools of Thought come 3 important philosophies: Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. And so in this little cartoon over on the right, you see that Confucianism explains that a good society has to start with good people. They need to be inspired and can't be forced to be good. Taoism, here it's spelled with a T, different ways of changing the letters over. Human beings are only a small part of the total reality. When people try to do too much, they'll upset the natural order of things. And legalism, government can't just rely on goodwill. It needs a practical system governed by law. So we're going to look more at these schools of thought, and we're going to look more at these philosophies by doing an acted out. Well, it'll be a experiential activity for you, so you'll actually get to experience what it would have been like to live under each of these 3 philosophies, and then you'll be able to decide which one you think would be the best. Because of these, several of them were actually used in future dynasties with different outcomes about how the people felt about them. So that's it. If you have questions, we'll talk about this tomorrow in class.